Hello, I'm Maïa Ponsonnet, lecturer in linguistics at the University of Western Australia, and this is a presentation that I gave in Lacan, which is a CNRS lab located in Paris, and I presented there on the 8th of January 2020. I presented in French, but this video is in English. And as the title indicates, it's on language shift, and more specifically, language shift to a Creole. The starting point of this presentation is questioning the common assumption about language and culture and how they are supposed to come hand in hand. There is this fairly widespread idea that losing one's language is losing one's culture. This is something I hear in day-to-day conversations with non-linguists or in the media or social media. And yeah, that relies upon a very sort of monolithic equation where, between language and culture, which means that if you lose your language, somehow your culture must have been wiped out. And I sort of wonder where that came from sometimes. I have wondered. Because, of course, as linguists, we know that the language-culture nexus is not demonstrated, or perhaps rather we know that it applies in some cases. Yes, there are certain things in languages that reflect a culture, but we also know that this is not necessarily a whole language corresponds to a whole culture. It's more nuanced. And I think the difficulty here is that as linguists as a community, in a sense, and especially descriptive linguists, have had very good reasons to let this equation between language and culture be assumed, to let it float around. And for very good reasons, because it is actually a helpful assumption when seeking funds to support minority languages. So of course, if you're asking money to help small groups maintain or revive their languages, well, then if people or policymakers believe that maintaining language is the condition to maintain culture, that's, of course, very useful. But I also wonder about the effect that this has on those of us who no longer use their ancestral language. And I fear that this may be somewhat stigmatizing, because if you think of a country like Australia, where a vast majority of Australian Indigenous people speak English or Creole precisely, of course, if you then claim that losing your language is losing your culture, then you must conclude that a lot of people have entirely lost their Indigenous culture, which I'm not sure that it's accurate or that it's a good thing to say. And that led me to ask the question, what is actually lost where the language goes? Another way is to ask it, is to formulate it, is what difference does language shift make as to what people can actually say and express? So what difference does it make in their day-to-day communication? Or does using a new lexicogrammatical code make a difference as to the way people communicate in day-to-day life? Or perhaps the alternative would be to wonder whether cultural factors may in fact be stronger than linguistic factors and lead to maintaining the same contents in communication in spite of using a different lexicogrammatical code. And in a way, this is another way to ask about linguistic relativity. So that's a sort of like side take on it. Although today I'm not going to dig very deeply into this, but this is also part, the literature on linguistic relativity certainly informed my work. What I'm going to present today is basically a case study that systematically compares linguistic resources in Kriol and Dalabon. Kriol is so Kriol is a Creole language in Australia, and Dalabon is one of the older Australian languages that Creole has replaced. And I'm going to carry out a systematic comparison of the resources in the semantic domain of emotions. Why emotions? Well, because I've worked on it a lot, and this is my topic of interest, but also it's actually a semiotically diverse and culturally rich domain, which means that it doesn't only have, like, say, nouns. If you look at ethnobotany, for instance, it's a lot of nouns, but it also has, verbs and all sorts of lexical items. But not only that, it also has constructions and metaphors and interjections, prosody. And in a sense, it's a very good sample to look at what difference language shift makes. And the question is to identify whether the different resources, linguistic resources, tools that we find in Creole compared to Dalabon, does that make a difference? Well, are they very different? And if they are different, does it make a difference into what people communicate and also perhaps in their conceptual representations? Note that this case study is detailed is presented in full in a book that you can see here, Difference and Repetition in Language Shift to a Creole. Routledge book, and there's even a discount code that you can use. And of course, the book is much more detailed than this presentation, which is a sort of a summary, and I will dive into some of the aspects of the comparison a bit more, completely overlooking some others that you can then find in the book. I would like to say here as well that the perspective I'm taking on language shift was inspired to me, originates in my interactions with Creole speakers, with whom I've been working and living for more than 20 years, in fact. And it strikes me that they don't really have very deep concerns about the loss of older Australian languages, and especially, with perhaps older people, a few older people I knew do, but the actual Creole generations tend to not have this concern, and instead they treat Creole as a precious identity marker. A few more words about the linguistic context, of course. So we're talking about, like I said, the Australian Creole, Kriol, which is an English-based Creole, and you can see where it is spoken here in the sort of lighter grey area on the map. And it is remarkably by far the largest Australian Indigenous language spoken in the country. It's a bit unclear how many speakers it has. The lowest estimation are probably 6,000, but that's not very realistic. Some say 30,000. I mean, presumably it's somewhere in between, but certainly much higher than most of the other older Australian languages, which at best have perhaps 3,000 speakers. Kriol emerged in the beginning of the 20th century and was adopted in the Baranga region where I work, as you can see on the map. It was adopted there after the Second World War. So it's a fairly new language. It has, just a few generations, I guess, behind it. The other language that the point of comparison in the study is the Dalabon, which is an Australian non-Pama-Nyungan language of the Gundwingan family, and you can see that it's located in the Baranga region, so that's the region where I've worked and where both Dalabon and Creole have a presence. Dalabon, of course, as some of you may know, as a non-Pama-Nyungan language, is highly polysynthetic. This means that it has a lot of morphology. So lots of little pieces of words that you can group together, stick together to make longer words. And that's probably what its most remarkable typological feature. It is, of course, severely threatened. Less than 10 speakers and very, very few full fluent speakers. And of course, it is being replaced by Creole. And of course, another reason why it was convenient to take Dalabon as a point of comparison with Creole is that I have worked on emotions in Dalabon myself and have published a monograph, an extensive description of the linguistic resources that encode emotions in Dalabon. So that's like the background of the comparison with Creole. However, Dalabon is, in this study, considered as a proxy for Australian Indigenous languages. And indeed, this is viable because there is good evidence from my own typological research and from elsewhere. There's good evidence of similarities amongst Australian languages in terms, well, in general, I guess, but also specifically in the semantic domains of emotions. And so it's even though this is a limited comparison just between Creole and one Australian language, it's easy to see how to contrast Australian features from and English-like features. To back up this comparison, I also worked with first and second-hand data on other Gunwingwin languages, so other languages of the same family as Dalabon, which are spoken in the same region, and also, of course, second-hand data from other languages consolidated in a number of typological studies. I would like to say that I'm not in this work. I'm not directly concerned with substrate or superstrate influence. So I believe that, so when I'm comparing Kriol and Dalabon, if I make the observation that, okay, we have this feature in Kriol and it's the same in Dalabon, I'm not saying that Kriol was influenced by Dalabon. My belief with respect to Kriol genesis in Australia is that the linguistic and historical background is far too complex to actually figure out exactly which feature can be traced back to which language, and it's also not really my question here. What we know is that there can be influences from all over Australia, and what is actually possible is also, like I said, to contrast Australian features and distinguish them from English-like features. So that's really what I'm doing. And also I'm assessing the functional difference. So it's not about talking about differences in terms of influence, but simply it's about comparing linguistic tools. With respect to the data, it's mostly based on first-hand data. I have an extensive Dalabon corpus with more than 60 hours transcribed, however, a smaller number of speakers because this is a severely threatened language. All female speakers, so of course here it's comparing female speech with female speech mostly because my Creole corpus, which is smaller, and has a much larger number of speakers, also mostly has female speakers. The Creole corpus is, like I said, only 20 hours transcribed, but the comparability with Dalabon is very high because it is more focused on emotions, and thanks to specific elicitation techniques, there's segment of the Dalabon corpus that really match the sort of elicitation I have done with Kriol. In addition to these sort of broad corpora, I'm using balanced data sets for quantitative analysis. So in each of the Dalabon and Kriol corpus, I've isolated 7 hours, which are particularly comparable due to the elicitation methods that have been used. And so that's what I use for quantitative comparisons. And there's also a sort of background Rembarga and Biningunwa corpora, which are two of the main neighboring languages, which are also very comparable corpora. Why are these corpora comparable? Well, like I said, I've used tailored visual stimuli specifically to collect emotion and, as far as possible, some rich and somewhat spontaneous data. These are things like photos that were designed specifically for this elicitation, as well as comments on videos or feature films. And this does approach spontaneity, but also because I've used the same stimuli with all of these languages, then there's very good comparability. Right, so what are the main sort of take-home point of this comparison that I present in full in my recent book? The main point probably is that language is plastic, by which I mean that it's malleable, it changes. And a point that I won't develop here that has mostly to do with the lexicon is that semantics does not depend on form. And that's not too surprising, of course. We know that there's no reason why the sense of a word would correlate with its form, or only in marginal cases, I should say. But this is probably something that we tend to forget when we think about language shift. And the other thing is that it's not just in the domain of the lexicon that it happens. It's also something that we observe when we see that, say, a certain tool that was productive and very useful in Dalabon is absent in Kriol, a grammatical tool. We find that speakers actually modulate and shape their language so that they can say what they have to say. And this plasticity significantly tempers the impact of language shift, or at least this is what this study suggests. On the other hand, there's one aspect where I did find significant differences between Kriol and Dalabon linguistically, and these this is figurative representations. And Dalabon, like many Australian languages, has a lot of body-based emotion metaphors, and we find that Creole has far less. That's an interesting difference. However, it is not clear that these differences have conceptual correlates. And what I did find is that cognition, so cognitive representations of emotions, have not changed as much as language, figurative language, has changed. And so cognition is apparently not immediately dependent on language. So the first part of this talk will be about the question of replacing absent tool, and I'll consider evaluative morphology to show how functions can evolve to circumvent the absence of a particular tool. And in the second part of the talk, I'll discuss this question of the difference between figurative representations of emotions, where we'll look at linguistic differences and also question whether they correlate with conceptual differences, and we'll see that probably not that much. Replacing absent tool, this is the first part. Here we're going to be looking specifically at Dalabon morphological diminutives. Morphological diminutives are pervasive in Dalabon, and they are absent in Creole. And this is in line with the respective morphological profiles of the languages, because as I said earlier, Dalabon is polysynthetic, it has a lot of morphology, so it doesn't come as a surprise that we have all these diminutives. Creole, on the other hand, like most Creoles, doesn't have very extensive morphology and doesn't have a morphological diminutive. So this is a difference, this absence of the diminutive, of the morphological diminutive, is a contrast that very much comes with having shifted to a language with a very different typological profile, a different grammatical architecture, if you like. So what happens to the functions of these morphological diminutives? Are they lost in translation? Well, that is what Woodbury concluded from a study of pretty much exactly the same type of tools, actually. Woodbury studied what happened to the expressive suffixes of Chupik in English translations. And he found that that they were actually largely lost in translation, that they were partly, the semantics was partly rendered by adjectival markers, in expressive markers in English, but not to the same extent. But that is not at all my conclusion from my observation in Creole. And what I found is that Creole has a lot of other tools that can do the same job. One thing that is important, I guess, the fact that my conclusion is different is also because I'm not looking at the same phenomenon. Woodbury was looking at translation, but I'm looking at language shift. And in translation, when you translate a text in Chupik into English, you have to follow the rules of English and to basically abide with what English speakers can understand and how they interpret the language. However, if you shift to English or to Creole in particular, actually, and speak, and this English or this Creole is the tool you come to use on a day-to-day basis with the members of your community, then you are not bound by what speakers of English in other parts of the world do, and you are free to change the language as much as you want so that you can express what you have to say. So this is. So let's take a look more specifically at these morphological diminutives in Dalabon. Dalabon has actually two of these morphological tools. There's an enclitic wood, which is the most frequent, and you can see it here. Gan godagut wood bugan nan kak no. This young woman, godagut wood, looks after her grandmother. So it means young. It comes from child etymologically, and it means young. And then there's a verbal prefix, yao, which etymologically means little, and you put it's a prefix that comes in the slot just before the verb root. Gore bara yao go back. Sorry, gore bara yao go back mean. So they grew old, dear old ladies. So you have here the yao, which qualifies the two old women that are endearing. Like most morphological diminutives, these two items have expressive connotations of endearment and affection. We saw it with the dear old ladies, which are not that were not little. So they have these connotations which are more emotional. There's also pragmatic attenuation with politeness effects that you would expect with any diminutives in the word. So can you give me can you lend me a bit of money? Of course, perhaps you're asking for more than a bit of money, but you're just attenuating the way of your request. And these are, like I said, cross-linguistically common functions of diminutives. One thing that is more specific about Dalabon morphological diminutives is that their most frequent expressive connotation is about compassion. Compassion defined as something bad happens to someone and I feel bad about it. So here, for instance, wah, garagang wood, he fell over, poor thing. So here it's about someone that just got hurt, and it's about feeling sorry about what happens to this character in a movie. Another way of using diminutives relative to compassion is that people typically use diminutive to express endearment and approval when they see people, when they witness people's compassion. So if in a movie, for instance, two characters were helping each other, giving something to each other, more generally sharing and caring for each other, that indexes compassion. That indexes that they have sympathy for the others, one for the other, and they want to help, etc. And this is something that is very culturally salient, and people typically use diminutives to sort of signal their approval. So here in this sentence where this woman looks after her grandmother with the diminutive on woman, as a matter of fact, this was a character that the speaker in a movie that the speaker didn't seem to find she was not particularly fond of this character. However, in this particular scene, the character is taking good care of her grandmother, and the presence of the diminutive indexes the approbation and endearment of the speaker at the sight of this sharing and caring behavior. Like I said, this is possibly culturally specific. The role of compassion, the importance of compassion in the social etiquette is culturally specific, and it seems to correlate with this usage of the diminutive. Another thing that is notable with the morphological diminutives in Dalabon is their high frequency. In my corpus, there's a diminutive every 5 or 6 minutes, and this is not limited to stories being told to children, or it's just probably the average frequency, at least in sort of female speech. And in fact, this is I've found comparable figures for frequency of diminutives in Rambarga and Biningunwok. So there's very comparable or quite comparable tools in these languages, and they do similar things, and they are just as frequent. And also in Dalabon, not only are diminutives frequent, they're also very flexible distributionally. And we've seen examples on nouns, but also on verbs. Of course, yao is a verbal prefix, as you can see here. So evidently, you can't really put it anywhere than on a verb. With would, it's more frequent on noun, but it's also very common on verb complexes, like you can see in this example. And in fact, you can basically put the diminutive where you want. Given a semantic context where it makes sense, you can put the diminutive on practically any parts of speech. And when the diminutive occurs on verb complexes, for instance, or elsewhere than on the noun, it has scope over the entire event. So it's not about saying, I feel sorry, or it's not about saying poor thing like this particular referent, as in the referent of the noun. It's more expressing compassion in general about the scene, the event. So what about what happens with language shift? What about this idea that perhaps these the meanings of these morphological diminutives are lost in translation or lost in language shift? Well, this is not what I found about the Dalabon diminutives. I find that instead in Creole, they are taken charge of by a number of linguistic tools, but interestingly, these tools are recruited from a range of diverse resources. So, of course, one of them is the adjectival diminutive lil, which is directly borrowed from English. But it's not the only one. And of course, if you just looked at that, then you would conclude that, oh my God, there's a lot missing there in terms of what you can do in Creole and what you can do in Dalabon. But in fact, another very good equivalent for Dalabon morphological diminutives happens to be an interjection. And here we'll see that the form is borrowed from English when the function, in fact, compares with Australian languages. So it's a blend. And there's another aspect which I won't develop in much detail here, which is reduplication, where the functions are borrowed from Australian languages and the form as well. It's just however, there are innovative extensions that cover the functions of Dalabon diminutives. So with adjectival diminutives, again, this is detailed. This is presented in more details in the book. But just to summarize, there's not that much to say because basically we have in Creole, we have the adjective little, which comes straight from the English little. Little is also an adjectival diminutive in English, and basically they have the same, very comparable semantic profiles. And so therefore there is a good deal of functional overlap with Dalabon morphological diminutives because of course affection, endearment, it's all there. But there's differences because lil doesn't really cover compassion. And also it's not distributionally flexible. All you can do with this adjective is modify a noun. There is an adverb, a little bit, that you can use to modify verbs, but it turns out that it doesn't really have expressive functions that much. So, yeah, that's not a very good equivalent of diminutive. So, of course, if you don't look any further, then you could conclude that these morphological diminutives of Dalabon are lost in language shift. However, there are also compassionate interjections that, in a sense, fill in the gap left by the adjectival diminutives. And these are the interjections bobala and bala. In fact, the bala is just a shortened version of bobala. I cannot see any difference in the way people use them. It's just that younger speakers tend to use the abridged version. Etymologically, they come from porfela, bobala, porfela. And they are used across generations to express compassion in Creole. So that is very, very clear, very straightforward. You can see an example here. Ol nenawan bala in killing bat Michel balabat. Or this poor grandmother, she's hitting herself on the head for her children, her grandchildren, in fact. This is a movie where a group of children have been forcibly taken away from their family. And it's a customary thing to hit oneself on the head and to bleeding in grief. Compassionate interjections are, in fact, a very good functional match for morphological diminutives. And apart from the semantics, there's also the reason that they are, in fact, flexible in distribution. We saw in the previous example that you can have bala as part of the noun phrase intonationally, where it's really more like a modifier. But you can also put it at the beginning of a clause or at the end of a clause or both, as one would expect with interjections. And indeed, in these cases, it has scope over the whole sentence and event. And so this is very similar to what you would do if you were to put the diminutive on a verb complex. And indeed, even in speakers' metalinguistic representations, bobala is a clear equivalent of would, and some speakers regularly and explicitly translated would in Dalabon with bobala in Kriol. Another very interesting observation is that compassionate interjections are more frequent in Kriol than in Dalabon. The frequency, if you look at the frequency of diminutives and compassionate interjections combined in Dalabon, then it's practically the same as just compassionate interjections in Kriol. So that really suggests that functionally one is a replacement for the other. And of course, this is all on the basis of balanced comparable data sets. In terms of where these resources come from, so how did Creole speakers come up with these tools? Where did they take the basis for it? It's a blend. So of course, there's the English etymology. So the form bobala comes from English. But semantically, the profile is very Australian. Compassionate interjections are attested in many Australian languages, as I found in a recent typological study. And in Dalabon, for instance, you have wetno, which also means bad. And so the etymology is not too far from poor fella. And you see that, for instance, in Terrebonne, you can say, "Got your wet mean wet no." He's upset, how sad. In Creole, you can say, "Tubala no good benji bla imbobala." So it's very similar. Yeah, a lot of Australian languages have these compassionate interjections. To conclude, these are the best equivalent for Dalabon diminutives. Of course, there's still some questions remain. So could using interjections make a difference in what's being conveyed? It's possible that, okay, linguists use two different labels to talk about these things, interjections on the one hand and morphological diminutives for the other. This is precisely because they don't exactly do the same thing. And one thing that differs is that morphological diminutives always accompany a description of the stimulus. So you need to say something and add some morphology to it to be able to express what you have to express. With interjections, you can use a single word utterance. So this is a big difference between, probably the main difference between these two tools. We could imagine that this makes a difference in communication, and that perhaps, if you have one tool or the other, time after time, conversation after conversation, that may make a difference in terms of maybe the salience of the emotion you're talking about in your conversation or something like that. And this could actually be tested in experimentally with communication chains, which could be a way forward to explore the impact of language shift. This said, as a matter of fact, so first I would like to say that this is possibly a difference that would occur with language shift, but it's actually quite subtle and not something one could see with the naked eye. It would have to be explored further. Another observation here is that basically interjections can do all the things that diminutives can do, plus they can be single utterances. And so since Kriol has interjections, in a certain sense, we don't expect that there would be much of a difference from not having diminutives. But this has to be verified. So to conclude, or to finish, there's another resource that have also some role in replacing Dalabon morphological diminutives, and this is reduplication. So reduplication is indeed classified as evaluative morphology, like morphological diminutives, because it is known that expressive values of reduplication are well attested. And in fact, reduplication is particularly common in Creole languages. So it doesn't come as a surprise that Creole has this morphological construction. And in fact, Creole does have relatively productive reduplication in this way, and in that it very much matches Dalabon and other Australian languages, and the reduplication in Creole indeed has very similar aspectual values as it has in other Australian languages. So on the face of things, Creole reduplication is the same as in other Australian languages. However, it also has expressive values, and some of them cover the functions of the diminutives in Dalabon. Here's an example, which I cannot play because it's not going to work with the video, but basically there's also an intonation there. So it says, "Babala, they all sleep na, langa bedi min 9 time bla bla at home now." And it says, "Oh, poor things, they're all sleeping, they're in bed, night has fallen on them in this orphanage there." It's in this movie where children are being taken away and put in an orphanage. And the speaker is obviously feeling sorry for them. There's several compassionate markers. There's bobala, the interjection. The contour, the prosodic contour, is also a compassionate feature, and it's also discussed in the book. I won't talk about it now. And then you have slip, which is a reduplicated form of verb for sleep. And it's important to note here that these verbs don't necessarily reduplicate that often. But when it does, it's most often in these sort of context when compassion is in order. And in fact, when speakers typically commenting on the same scenes in Dalabon, when Dalabon speakers watch the movie, typically they used compassionate diminutives. So what's interesting with reduplication is that, in fact, these expressive connotations seem to be partly innovative compared to typically Australian reduplication, which appears to have less expressive functions for reduplication. And I'm not going to go into the detail of the analysis here. It's in the book. But what's the take-home point is that Creole reduplication is clearly influenced by Australian languages. So we have an example here of a tool that replaces morphological diminutive that comes straightforwardly from Australian languages. But the expressive functions are partly innovative or expanded, and as it happens, they cover the functions of Dalabon morphological diminutives. So to conclude, in terms of the impact of language shift in this respect about morphological diminutives, we find that some expressive resources that are productive in Dalabon are absent in Kriol. That's the starting point, but that the corresponding expressive functions are not lost in translation or lost in language shift, but instead covered by a number of different tools. And these tools are not limited to the borrowing from substrates like with the adjective little. But instead, speakers have picked all sorts of resources that they could find and change them around and transform them or recycle them to be able to express the same thing as is expressed with Dalabon morphological diminutives in Dalabon. And so these are with interjections and reduplication. And what I see here is that speakers make do with what they have in order to say what they want to say. So if something's not available, well, they just make up something else. Language is plastic and speakers are creative. This is not really surprising, but again, it's very good to keep in mind when we deal with language shift, because perhaps it can prevent us being a bit blinded by this idea of language shift as a loss. And of course, there remains research questions such as perhaps, yes, different types of tools could make subtle differences, and this is definitely something to look into. I'm not saying language shift makes no difference at all, but I'm saying this is not something we can see from, with our naked eyes. We need to address that experimentally, and that would indeed be a good place to continue to explore the impact of language shift. Now, coming to my second part, where I focus on linguistic differences around figurative language, but where I also show that perhaps they don't have very strong conceptual correlates. So let's first take a bit of a tour of figurative representations of emotions in Dalabon. One thing that is very salient is the prevalent role of the body in descriptions of emotions, and in particular, what I call body-based emotion metaphors. These are things, it's comparable to, heartbreak in English. Things like gang yo yo mu, so gang means belly, and yo yo mu means flow. So having a flowing belly, which doesn't mean much, but what it really means is feel good or be nice, and therefore there's a metaphor. Feel emotionally good is like having a flowing belly. You can see that in the example, this expression is used to talk about someone who's and there's a number of these, like, bad belly for mean, nasty, belly cracked for emotional shock, belly blocked for nervous or apprehensive, you name it. I documented more than 40 compounds, several of them actually frequent. There's also about 15 compounds with the heart. And so in total, as documented in my 2014 book, 60 or more body-based figurative expressions for emotions have been documented in Dalabon. So we are not like in this context, because of course English also has that, but we're talking about in English just a few colorful expressions that are used for, perhaps stylistic effect, not very sort of day-to-day expressions. In Dalabon, instead, it's a coherent network of metaphors that outline properties of emotions. And I'm not going to go into the detail of that, but the most salient one, the prevalent one, if you like, is the belly as a seat of emotion. And that's not just Dalabon, that's actually most Australian. It's the dominant seat of emotions in Australia, the belly. And also one thing that is important to note is that these metaphors are conceptually active for speakers, which means that these lexemes are not completely opaque. It doesn't mean that people necessarily believe that emotions are in the belly or not. It's more that symbolically they they are aware of these representations. In fact, they are used in rituals, etc. Okay, so of course, most languages have these sort of associations between the body and emotions. It's not at all exceptional. What is somewhat more notable is the extent to which Dalabon does that, and this is actually quite typical of Australian languages, as I've recently documented. And then, of course, the question becomes, does Kriol have such a developed network of body-based metaphors? And the short answer is actually no. The long answer, so that, of course, supports the idea that language shift does make a difference. Of course, there's also the question here about what other Creole languages do. But there's actually a longer answer, which is that, yes, that's a very clear observation that these figurative representations are not as well entrenched in linguistic conventions in Creole as they are in Dalabon. However, they do surface where speakers are less constrained by linguistic conventions, which in fact indicates that they are conceptually relevant, although they are not strongly supported linguistically. So I'm going to first explain a bit about this lower linguistic incidence, and we'll see that there's very few lexicalized metaphors relatively few lexicalized metaphors in Creole. And then I'll talk about the conceptual relevance, which is about free metaphors, gestures, etc. This is a full list of all the body-based lexicalized metaphors that occur in my 20 hours Creole corpus. So we have 5, as you can see, and in fact, these 3 are rare. They're evanescent. So of course, we have these 2, which are reasonably frequent. And clearly, so it's good bingy, good belly for feel good, and bad belly for feel bad. And that reflects the most frequent body-based trope that occurs across Australian languages, which is the belly as a seat of emotions. So that's actually quite typically Australian. And yeah, there's a clear Australian influence here. However, we are talking about 5 collocations in total, and 3 of them are rare. And even good pingy and no good pingy are not that frequent in actual speech. They're reasonably frequent, but there's also all sorts of happy, sad, English lexemes that have English etymologies. And also good pingy and no good pingy is apparently becoming less frequent in the speech of younger speakers of Creole. So we're very far from the 60 or so compounds of Dalabon, and we are indeed closer to English, where we do have a couple of expressions, but not very many. There's a question that is discussed in more depth in the book about why is it the case? Why doesn't Creole have more of these? What blocked their occurrence, etc.? And that's possibly, this is perhaps something where purely linguistic factors came into play. I won't delve into this here. It's in the book. But now we'll talk about the conceptual relevance of body-based metaphors for Creole speakers. So, like I said, there's not very many lexicalized metaphors, but there are some. And also what we find are free metaphors that relate to the body, and the body also surfaces in gestures. Free metaphors are metaphors that are not fully conventionalized, they're not lexicalized, but instead they are created by speakers as they speak, usually for stylistic effect, that sort of things. And therefore, because they are sort of like, their own speaker's creation, they must correspond to active conceptual representations. Not to say that speakers believe them literally, but simply that they must have had this symbol active in this conceptual association active, otherwise the metaphor would just not occur. So yes, we do find that Creole speakers use free belly emotion metaphors. So there's a number of metaphors where the body, and in particular the belly, is a figurative basis for emotion. There's far less, especially like if you compare to the prevalence of this in Creole, but there are some. And sometimes these metaphors actually are quite close to Dalabon metaphors. Here, for instance, Daiba Mitchell Binjina, she tied up her own belly because she was basically feeling anxious, which is something we find in Creole, or something that's more phrasal. Feel nogunna imbiji. So here the belly is explicitly depicted as the as a container of emotions. So this is definitely there in spite of the relative lower incidence of lexicalized metaphors. And another very interesting domain aspect of language where these metaphors surface are gestures. And gestures are another aspect of language that is less constrained by conventions. And indeed, in Creole, we do find that speakers use metaphorical gestures that involve the belly. What's particularly interesting is that they can actually relate, these gestures can actually relate to metaphors that are not attested in verbal Creole, but that are attested in Dalabon. Here's an example. I won't play the video again because it's going to mess up with this video. So it's a speaker who was explaining the meaning of the word "settle down," which means calm down. Oh, let's see if I can play the video. So she's saying, "Oh yeah, you know, that's what happens when when I'm feeling bad, I go and see this old woman, and she talks to me, and she makes me feel better. It settles down." And the speaker has this gesture with her hand, from up to from the higher part of her abdomen downwards, and she does that several times. So here, there's a fairly transparent conceptual metaphor, which is feeling better is like having something going through your abdomen. And in fact, it's not a completely isolated gesture. It occurred another time with another young Creole speaker in my corpus, so it's probably not an isolated token. However, there is no corresponding verbal metaphor attested in Creole. But at least not in my corpus. I mean, yes, of course, I'm sure if I asked a speaker to say, "Oh, your binge is flowing through" or something, yes, they may endorse it, but they haven't used it spontaneously. However, the metaphor is actually well attested in Dalabon, and just in lexicalized expression, we have at least 3 that are about, belly flowing, clear way, run, flow, etc. This is all about feel good, feeling relieved. And actually, flowing through gestures are attested in Dalabon and also in Benin Gunwok. So it's similar gestures, although with a very, very different style. So what we see here is that Creole speakers' gestures realize metaphors that do occur in verbal Dalabon, but not in Creole speech. And precisely they are realized when speakers are less constrained by linguistic conventions, because they occur with gestures, which suggests that the metaphors are conceptually relevant, and perhaps the reason why they weren't lexicalized is because there was this linguistic blockage somehow, but nevertheless, they resurface elsewhere. Another interesting observation here is about metalinguistic salience. So I said earlier that good bingy and no good bingy, which are the 2 lexicalized expressions that have some currency, are not necessarily overwhelmingly frequent. However, they are typically treated as identity markers by Creole speakers. So people will tell you, "Oh yeah, we always use no good bingy," or in direct question about Creole emotional lexicon, someone said, "Oh yeah, in Creole we don't have that many," which is not true. I mean, there's plenty. We don't have that many. We just have good bingy and a good bingy. Or speakers want to replace other words like happy or sad by good bingy, no good bingy, etc. So to conclude, we seem to have a contrast between linguistic relevance and between conceptual relevance and linguistic prevalence here, where the belly and also other body part tropes are not as linguistically entrenched in Creole. There's lower productivity and frequency. So linguistically, Creole is more like English. However, belly-based metaphor, which are conceptually relevant to Creole, and they're also a cultural symbol, which accounts for the fact that they are, treated as identity markers. And what we see, therefore, is that culturally specific representations persist irrespective of the lexicogrammatical code in use. So we have another set of lexical items, and this set has less metaphors with the body, but nevertheless, these culturally specific representations persist. Of course, there's a caveat. Well, the first caveat is that I've talked a lot about there's all sorts of differences that I haven't mentioned here and that are dealt with in the book, which is about not just the metaphors Kriol doesn't have, but the metaphors Kriol have that Dalabon doesn't have. So, of course, in such a short talk, I'm only limited to a few topics, and the book contains more. Another caveat is also, will these culturally specific representations of that associate the body emotion and emotions, will they persist over time? Or will they perhaps fade away with generations, which is very possible especially without a strong linguistic basis. It could be that the linguistic basis is necessary for these things to persist. So to conclude and to wrap up about the impact of language shift. So what's the impact of language shift on day-to-day communication, on what people can say or not? Language is plastic and speakers are creative and make do with what they have. And that means that a lot of meanings and functions can be preserved or recreated in spite of formal changes. And therefore, many communicative functions are actually maintained in language shift. But this is easy to miss because of formal differences. And we're all too often blinded by these formal differences, even as linguists. One thing that language shift seems to have altered are the tropes that speakers use to describe emotions, especially in the lexicon. This is indeed the most significant linguistic difference in this semantic domain between Kriol and Dalabon. Yet, speakers' conceptual representations have not shifted accordingly, and therefore they may shift later, but what we see here is that the impact of language on conceptual representations in this specific domain is not immediate. It's not immediate. Might at least there is, if it does create a difference, there has to be a lag. And of course, further research is needed. For instance, on these fine, subtle differences, does using interjections or instead of diminutive or as well as diminutives, does it make a difference? Will conceptual representations of emotions shift in future generations, etc.? But I would like to say that as a take-home point here, what I find is in studies throughout, and the book brings further evidence, is that it is culture that drives linguistic structures in language shift rather than the opposite. And in a sense, this is a fairly soothing message for those who fear for the heritage language. Okay, it doesn't mean that there's no point in trying to maintain a heritage language, because certainly there are these, languages do contain some culturally specific aspects, that are worth studying, and it's also just very interesting intellectually. But having shifted to another language doesn't mean that a whole culture is lost and written off. And also, there may be some ways if reclaiming a heritage language, which, if you come from English and your heritage language is polysynthetic, ergative, has all these difficult features, there's also other ways of doing it, because you may choose to just reinsert some specific emotional metaphors, for instance, or just work on some more specific aspects of language that, as a speaker, you evaluate, as a member of the community, you think are particularly important. So this is also a call for more nuance in our approaches to all this.